There is no illness more debilitating than lack of intellect. Caliph Ali, radiallahu anhu. Chapter 1. Islam and Atheism. 1.1. How can Islam answer atheism? For many atheists and former Muslims alike, Islam, like other religions, is a myth or superstition, or a development of earlier myths and superstitions. For them, like other blind faiths, Islam is problematic. So, the question arises as to exactly how a so-called dogmatic religion can actually address the challenges of atheism, an atheism which is ostensibly based on intelligence and science. There are two things to mention at this juncture. The first is that many of the conceptualizations of atheists, as well as those of former Muslims, are based on straw man arguments or a simplification of very complicated issues. Secondly, many of the things that are discussed by new atheism are not new at all, having been debated for hundreds of years, and now merely repackaged for a new age. Objections raised against the existence of God are in fact old, and were debated centuries ago in centers of learning like Baghdad. Atheism, which may be defined as the refusal to believe in God or any God at all, is the personal decision of any individual, but whether that decision is rooted in knowledge, wisdom, and objectivity at all times is another question. Similarly, may not the decision to adopt atheism have other motives? To what degree do caprice, notoriety, arrogance, or even vengeance, along with a host of other motives and ambivalent feelings, affect that decision? Preconceived ideas regarding believers are also found in atheist groups and individuals. So, let us shed any preconceived notions and ideas, and enter this discussion objectively. Many of those things deemed true regarding Islam, but which are in fact distorted or misrepresented, are answered in chapters 4, 5, and 6. What is intended in this chapter is to give an overview of how rational theology developed. On the one hand, there is theology, the discussion of religious beliefs, while on the other, there is also rational theology rooted in the logical basis of any belief. Rational theology is a central pillar to the religion of Islam. 1.2. The prime importance of Kalām. Kalām is the name given to rational theology after its development in the early years of Islam. Linguistically, Kalām means speech. The reason for the name was because speaking was seen as a requisite for debating religious creed and presenting its rational basis. Others have stated that the word Kalām became coterminous with rational theology at a later time when the nature of the Qur'ān was debated amongst Muslims. The word Kalām contrasted the speech of man with the speech of God, the Qur'ān. Whatever the actual origins of the name, Kalām is a science, a rational tool that is utilized in analyzing any argument. The term Kalām was used by two groups, one of which allowed Greek and other philosophies to dictate its rational discourse, while the other group were traditionalists, who utilized rational tools to dismantle any argument that contravened the Qur'an and consensus-based belief. The latter group may occasionally be found condemning Kalām in the early period. This, however, only occurred since a clear distinction had not been drawn between rational theology in defense of the Qur'an, prophetic tradition, and consensus-based belief, and the Kalām of the philosophers who contravened religious orthodoxy and attempted to fit the teachings of ancient Greek philosophy into the Islamic context. At a later period, once the philosophers had lost their sway over politics and the persecution of Orthodox Muslims, the term Kalām became specifically to mean the rational theology of the traditionalist Ahlus Sunnah. A question arises here as to whether rational belief is encouraged in the Qur'an and prophetic tradition, or something introduced by theologians out of necessity. The Qur'ān obliges people to have knowledge of the foundations of their belief and prohibits blind conformity. The Qur'ān states, "Do not follow that which you have no knowledge of, because surely the hearing, sight, and heart will be questioned regarding that." Qur'ān 17:36. In numerous verses of the Qur'ān, the divine imperative is to know. Therefore, the foundation of belief in Islam must be based upon knowledge, rather than mere conjecture. Furthermore, throughout the prophetic traditions, there are mentions of dialogues, debates, and discourses between the Prophet ﷺ and the people of Mecca who attempted to discredit him. Such debates, as is evident, were consistently based upon the rational mind. In like manner, Kalām theologians throughout the subsequent centuries debated and discoursed on the numerous contentions against Islamic creed within this rational approach. The role of the scholars to elucidate various areas of theology to the multitudes became integral to the society of Muslims. It is related that Ustad Abu Bakr al-Furuq, after having studied the proofs of religion for years, decided to retire to worship in isolation. While in seclusion, he heard someone call out to him, "Having become a proof of a law for the creation, yet you choose to run away from that very creation." On hearing this, Ustad Abu Bakr abandoned his retirement and went back to teaching. Similarly, Abu Ishaq al-Isfarayini, a rational theologian from the early period, ascended the mountains of Lebanon to avoid the persecution of philosophical zealots. The mountains he took refuge in turned out to be a place of worship and retreat for a very zealous religious group. Observing them engrossed in their form of worship, Abu Ishaq is recorded as reprimanding them, saying, "Consumers of cannabis, you abandon the nation of Muhammad ﷺ, even as the heretics overwhelm them." In response, they said, "We have no patience with the people, and neither do we have the capabilities that God has given you in responding to their arguments." So, Abu Ishaq returned back to his home and penned works in response to the arguments of detractors of Islam. These stories inform us that the role of the rational theologian, mutakallim, was of prime importance in Islam, simply because the foundations of the beliefs cannot be allowed to stand on shaky ground. 1.3. The categories of belief. Beliefs in general have been divided by theologians into three categories. 1. Belief which relies solely upon the intellect. 2. Belief which relies upon Scripture, in the case of Islam, that being the Qur'ān and the prophetic tradition. 3. Belief which relies on both. The verification of the truthfulness of any religious scripture should be preceded by a debate as to whether a God exists at all, before questioning what he has revealed to a prophet, and, indeed, whether that prophet is truthful. It has also been argued that the existence of God and his divine power, for instance, can be rationally proven without recourse to Scripture, while the validation of many other beliefs are deemed rationally possible only through divine revelation, such as the metaphysical realm. As such, rational theology gives primary importance to two things, namely the rational basis for the existence of God and the proof for revelation, on which all matters proceeding after are determined. 1.4. Degrees of proof. Here it would be appropriate to mention what is meant by a proof. It is the type of proof sufficient for the intellect of that person. Since not every person can be familiar with philosophical or scientific terminology, or able to compose a formal syllogistic argument, it would be sufficient for some to respond simply saying, "the creation around us," when asked how they know God exists. A response that would not, of course, satisfy the philosophically or scientifically trained with doubts regarding God, nor an outright denier of God, those who use their philosophical and scientific background to argue the very existence of God, the validity of the Qur'ān and the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Any response to such arguments would thus be the domain of Kalām. It is related that someone once asked a Bedouin how he knew that a creator exists. The Bedouin responded by saying that when he observes camel tracks and camel dung trails, he knows there is a camel. Similarly, when he observes the mountains, valleys, deserts, and oceans, he knows there is a creator. This type of reasoning may be unconvincing to many with a modern secular education, yet it was sufficient for that Bedouin. Likewise, an old woman in a village was asked the same question while she was cooking meat broth in a large cauldron. She responded by saying that when she cooks and stirs the broth, if she stops stirring, the contents remain still and the broth only moves when she stirs it. So when she observes the sunrise and the sunset, and the various positions of the sun throughout the day and during the seasons, the moon waxing and waning throughout the month, and the constellations changing with regularity every 3 months in the hemisphere, she knows with certainty that someone is moving all these celestial bodies the way she moves her broth. And if there were not, nothing would be moving. When further asked whether that God could be one God and not 2 or multiple gods, she responded by saying that if another woman came to stir alongside her, they would dispute as to the direction of the stirring, and the cauldron would tip and spill all its contents. So by the same reasoning, if there were 2 or more gods, they would disrupt the perfect balance observed in nature, and the universe would be in chaos. Such reasoning given by the Bedouin and the old woman, while sufficient for them, for others may lack sophistication. It is these latter people who deserve a sound response from the Kalām specialists. It is related that once Imam al-Razi was walking through a crowd of people attempting to meet him because of his great fame. An old woman was passing and inquired as to what was happening. She was told that the man the crowd was greeting was none other than the renowned Kalām specialist and legal theorist, Imam al-Razi, who had over 100 different proofs for the existence of God. She responded by saying, 100 proofs for 100 doubts. At first sight, this may seem to be a rebuke of the great al-Razi, but in reality, it is rebuking those for whom Imam al-Razi had formulated those arguments in order to remove their doubts. Knowing how to give detailed responses to people who may be in doubt, or to those who present misgivings, is an obligation in Islam on the Kalām specialists. However, the general public too are obliged to learn a summary proof for their beliefs with, according to one group of theologians, their faith deemed sinful or invalid through such blind conformity if not. The mere utterance of the articles of faith is for a person to be regarded as a Muslim by society, and in his dealings to be known as a Muslim. Certitude in faith varies, though, and a person can easily fall into one of the following 3 categories. 1. A person's faith is doubtful or uncertain. Then that faith is rendered invalid, and the person is categorized as an unbeliever. 2. A person outwardly professes faith, yet inwardly does not believe. Then that faith is also rendered invalid, and the person is categorized as a hypocrite. Or 3. A person has certainty in faith, but yet does not acquire at least the general summary proofs by which he can safeguard his faith and remove doubts. Then while that faith is acceptable, the person is nevertheless deemed a sinner. Some theologians deem such a person as an unbeliever, even though outwardly he may be treated as a Muslim. This demonstrates the extent of condemnation of ignorance in Islam. and the blameworthy nature of blind conformity in faith issues. What is meant by valid faith is that which is between the individual and his creator. Outwardly, a person can be pious with all an Islamically religious exterior, but inwardly he could be a hypocrite or a doubter, the dire consequences of which remaining unknown to people on earth. 1.5. Blind Conformity. Traditional Kalām theologians understood blind conformity in belief to be dangerous to one's faith, with some taking the view that the belief of the conformist was invalid, no matter how staunch or dogmatic the adherent might appear. This raises the commonly held position that all faith is merely blind belief, with any acquired certainty lacking real proof. The response in this case is that a person who has faith with certainty will have either acquired that faith through necessary proofs, or from no proof at all. If the person has faith without proof, then this is the kind of blind faith that is commonly understood as religious faith. According to theologians, this type of blind faith is not the sort of faith that will give salvation. They argue that firmness and certitude of belief based on some type of proof is what grants a person salvation in the hereafter. Anything that falls short of certainty will leave the individual in doubt, imagination, or mere conjecture, insufficient for salvation. Appearances can be deceiving. A person may seem to be a staunch believer, but yet has no salvation as he bases his faith on uncertainty. His staunchness and zealotry merely serve to cover that person's own doubt. Some people attempt to validate the belief of a blind conformist by saying that early generations did not know technical terms of philosophy and science, and as such their faith was valid. The response to this is simple. As outlined earlier, if they were confronted with new arguments and doubts, it would be a communal obligation to counter the new arguments, and every individual who was exposed to any new type of doubt would have to learn, according to his capacity, the response to any such type of obscurities. Others have argued that there is simplicity in blind conformity, because it is reported that the likes of Imam al-Razi said at the time of his death that people should hold on to the religion of the old woman in the story. It has also been reported that the pious Caliph, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, exhorted the people to follow the religion of the old woman, children, and the Bedouin. This would appear to mean that having knowledge of the theological intricacies and the counter-arguments to philosophical skeptics would not be incumbent on the old woman. Similarly, the entire community should not be obligated to learn rational theology at all its various levels in order to counter skeptics and philosophical doubt. The response to this claim is that the statements of both the Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz and that of Imam al-Razi were made in reference to tenets of faith that were so well known that even the common people were familiar with those tenets as being orthodoxy, whilst heretical sects were questioning such tenets. In response to the obvious nature of such tenets being well known to all Muslims, and not just the professional theologian, both the Caliph and the Imam responded alike with their statements, even though they lived 500 years apart. Neither does it entail that people need to know technical terms and specialist jargon in order to be rational. Both philosophers and rational theologians are known to give complicated names to simple concepts. In the Kalām method, this is done with Arabic, and in Western philosophy, with sometimes difficult-sounding Latin names being given to simple concepts. That a person can be rational without being professionally trained in philosophy or rational theology is demonstrated in the stories of the Bedouin and the old woman. These statements, however, cannot be taken as a validation for blind faith and conformity. 1.6. The intuitive mind of the pious predecessors, salaf. Many concepts that are theoretical for most can be self-evident for the very intelligent. And this is one of the prime reasons that many in the early generation did not feel the need to enter into technical discussion with opponents of Islamic belief. The Caliph Ali, radiallahu anh, for instance, was very sagacious and had an intellect that was unparalleled. Besides being immensely knowledgeable, he could apprehend the most difficult issues with ease. His knowledge was so vast that he stated he could write a commentary on 7 verses of the Qur'ān, the opening Al-Fatiha chapter, which would need to be carried by over 70 camels due to its immense size. He was also described as the door to the city of knowledge by the Prophet ﷺ himself. A man such as he could grasp deep concepts quickly and give impromptu responses to difficult questions with ease. He had no need to read books of philosophy, and neither did those around him, as they could always just refer back to him. Once, the Caliph Ali radiallahu anh, was standing to deliver a sermon when a man stood up and asked a question regarding inheritance laws, which for anyone else would have taken contemplation and calculation. The Caliph Ali radiallahu anh answered immediately without such a need. Those who were present in the audience were astounded at his brilliance. This particular question on inheritance laws became known as the pulpit question in the books of jurisprudence. Another story relating to Caliph Ali radiallahu anh's judgments, declared the best of judges by the Prophet ﷺ, was that of when 2 men approached him stating person A had 3 loaves of bread, and person B had 5 loaves of bread, and while they were eating, person C joined them for the meal. Prior to person C's departure, after the meal, he gave the 2 others 8 silver dirham coins, from which person A received 3 dirhams, and person B 5. Receiving the 3 dirhams, person A complained, saying that the 8 dirhams should be divided equally, both taking 4 each. Person B, however, insisted that the division should be in accordance with the number of loaves of bread that each had contributed. They decided to approach the Caliph Ali radiallahu anh for a fair judgment. The Caliph gave his judgment without hesitation, saying to person A, "If you want a fair judgment, then you only get 1 silver coin." The man was astonished and inquired, "How is that so?" To which the Caliph Ali radiallahu anh replied, "3 of you ate 8 loaves in total, but we do not know the exact amount each one ate, so your shares are treated equally. As there were 3 to eat and 8 loaves, we multiply 3 by 8, which equals 24. As you contributed 3 loaves of bread, we times 3 with the number of heads, 3, which equals 9. This is your contribution. However, you ate 8 portions of the overall 24 portions, and therefore only have 1 share of 24 remaining. As for your companion, he contributed 5 loaves of bread, and if we multiply 5 by the number of heads, which is 3, it equals to 15. From that 15, your companion ate 8 portions, leaving a remainder of 7. Therefore, 1 remains for you, and 7 for your companion, which means you take 1 dirham, and he takes 7. In another incident, a woman approached him with the complaint that her brother had died, leaving 600 dirhams, and the family had only given her 1 coin. In this particular case, she never mentioned who the other inheritors were, yet what needed to be calculated was intuitive and obvious for the Caliph Ali radiallahu anh, who promptly replied saying, "Your brother must have left behind as inheritors a wife, a mother, 2 daughters, and 12 brothers." The woman said, "That is correct." To which the Caliph Ali radiallahu anh said, "Then that is your fair share, and they have not wronged you." The reason why the Caliph Ali radiallahu anh was able to answer so quickly was because what was theoretical for the majority was self-evident for him. In later times, minds became lazy and slow-witted, with little or no patience for seeking knowledge, and even after learning something new, they would forget it afterwards. It is for this reason that the rational theologians emerged, to fulfill the communal obligation of refuting the arguments and challenges presented by doubters of Islam or even its outright enemies. 1.7. The Mind and the Intellect. The prime importance of the mind and the intellect is illustrated in a conversation between Caliph Umar and the Prophet ﷺ, when the Prophet ﷺ was extolling the afterlife, the horrors of the grave, and the having to face the two angels in that grave who dispense punishment to the unbelievers. At that point, the Caliph Umar asked, "Will my mental faculties be intact at that time?" To which the Prophet ﷺ replied, "Yes." And the Caliph Umar said, "I should be able to handle their questioning then." The Prophet ﷺ responded with, "Umar is certain and truthful." The angels in the grave are said to be frightening in appearance and manner, and a person will be sorely tested with the questions they ask regarding his faith. The Caliph's question indicates that he knew the prime importance of the mind and rational thinking. Nevertheless, truth and conviction via the rational faculty and the mind can be acquired with silent contemplation, without speech, and it is not essential that an individual be adept in philosophy, science, or anything technical. The rational theologians acted to organize ideas and terms, and formalized the rationale and thinking involved in the Islamic creed, to ease those people not finding theoretical discussions intuitive. In every subsequent age, the rational theologians produced a jargon deemed appropriate to that age and time. For that reason, Imam al-Ghazali discouraged certain people, especially if they already had a conviction within the Islamic creed, from exploring Kalām, likening Kalām to a medicine that should be taken in appropriate measure. This position of Imam al-Ghazali is sometimes used by those who deem rational theology irrelevant today. Those who prefer a kind of blind faith and custom, passed down from generation to generation. Such an interpretation would be a misreading of what Imam al-Ghazali meant. His point was that if doubts and obscurities do become commonplace, then the learning of rational argument to remove that doubt is an obligation. That is why he likened Kalām to medicine, a medicine that cures the mind from doubt, cynicism, skepticism, and imparts certainty. In today's globalized world, and in light of numerous campaigns by New Atheism to discredit belief in God, and more particularly Islam, Kalām must come to the forefront with its counterarguments. 1.8. Religious Hypocrisy. What is sometimes ignored, whether by believers in Islam or not, in any discussion of punishments for disbelief in the grave, is the punishment of a hypocrite compared with that of a doubter. What is mentioned in prophetic reports is that when the person is questioned in the grave regarding belief, he will say, "I do not know. I just heard the people say things which I then said too." In response, the angels will rebuke him, saying, "You never read and never understood." What such types of report highlight for us is the clear condemnation of religious hypocrisy, that of outward piety with inward disbelief. Perhaps these are the type of hypocrites and conformists who turn many people away from the true path. Bertrand Russell mentions such types in his frank and honest autobiography, recounting horrific things that a priest he knew did in his formative years. He concludes by saying that some of the greatest evil on earth has been perpetrated by religious people. Roald Dahl, the children's writer, also claims in Boy, Tales of Childhood, that the beatings he received from supposedly religious people during his childhood led him to disbelieve in God. There are countless examples of organized religions or cults in all societies, where people who lack a real conviction in God or who are hypocrites carry out evil. Some atheists may say that the religion itself, and in the case of Islam, the Sharia or the Qur'ān, are to be blamed. Inevitably, the perpetrators of such evils would be, aside from the hypocrites, conformists or cultists. This is why hypocrisy is of two types. The first type, religious hypocrisy, is where a person does not believe at all and knows he does not believe, but rather feigns religion for ulterior motives. The second type of hypocrisy is where a person remains a Muslim only through his parents being Muslim, and not out of any conviction, as he might be Christian if he had been born to parents who were Christians. This is why rational theologians emphasize that the first divine obligation on every sane adult is investigation into the truth. Discouraged by the above affirmation, some religious people will discourage others in turn into investigating anything since, they will be told, this leads to doubt. The correct theological position, however, is that investigation is the first obligation to remove doubt and the possibility of doubt. The harmful consequences of blind faith and fear of the unknown are such that when arguments are presented outside of their comfort zone, conformists will fall into doubt or cover up their doubt by becoming zealots. A worst-case scenario for one who does not investigate would be, while in the throes of death, an argument or doubt comes to him, which he is unable to respond to, and thus he dies in disbelief. This is why appearances can be deceiving. A person may seem religiously observant and pious, but inwardly be a hypocrite or a doubting Thomas, and subsequently die a non-Muslim, while the people of the world would be completely unaware of this. Conversely, you may have a person who is irreligious, and then at the time of death or just before, he dies, discovers the truth, and dies a believer. And again the people around him would be totally unaware. This is why mere mortals cannot say with certainty of any individual that he is going to hell or is in hell, unless they have divine revelation to that effect. All we can say is that a person died as a Muslim or a non-Muslim in terms of what we know regarding him, but that the final judgment is with God. 1.9. Salvation through Kalām. Some people at this juncture will wonder whether it is sufficient to follow the Qur'ān and the prophetic tradition to attain salvation without rational theology. The response would be that the very belief in the Qur'ān and the truthfulness of the Prophet ﷺ is based upon rationality and the rational conclusion that there is a God. Belief in the Qur'ān and Islam necessitates the conclusion that a God exists and has sent down messengers and prophets with a divinely revealed scripture. It may also be possible, rather it has occurred and continues to occur till this day, that people who may have knowledge of the Qur'an and the prophetic way end up misinterpreting the Qur'an and the prophetic traditions simply because they have no depth in the rational sciences, Islamic legal theory, rhetoric, and grammar. In fact, many of the distortions of Islam are made by such people. They misinterpret the Qur'an and the prophetic traditions for ulterior motives, and though some may be sincere in their quest, due to their belief not being grounded in rational theology, they effectively misguide themselves and others. Others claim that rather than learning about God through the rational process of Kalām and its ancillary sciences, it would be far better if a person engrossed himself in spiritual practices, in the way mystics fight the desires of the lower carnal self, by devoting themselves to God in such a manner to enlighten his soul, spirit, mind, and heart. The response to this claim is that while curbing carnal desires is praiseworthy, and the curing of the spiritual ailments of the heart a divinely ordained obligation, it is much hindered if the person is ignorant of the God being worshipped. To worship God, a person must know God with his mind and heart, know what is necessary for God, what is possible and impossible, alongside a minimum knowledge of essential divine attributes, and the minimum proof for such beliefs. As well as these, a person must be able to repel any doubts that may occur. Otherwise, such a worshipper who isolates himself for spiritual practices is no different to claimants of other faiths who believe they have attained enlightenment. In reality, such people who are ignorant of the rational basis of belief in God are prone to claiming miracle-making, superstition, imagination of visions in a wakeful state and dreams, and other elements of misguidance. Some Eastern mystics claim that if the body is freed from its material desires, then a person can reach enlightenment. But does this enlightenment conform to a knowledge that does not contradict the rational mind? If it does contradict rational thought, then it is not enlightenment, but rather a satanic delusion or a delusion of the ego. Anyone who rushes into spiritual practice without attaining the requisite knowledge first is in fact largely following a hidden desire, such as in many of the New Age groups, or Eastern mystical groups, or deviated Sufi cults, where that desire could be love of leadership, wealth, fame, notoriety, or even a desire for miracles. In fact, traditional Sufis warned against such people. Authentic, early Sufi masters would first teach the adept rational proof for the existence of God and his divine attributes. One of the earliest and reliable books, Al-Qushayri's epistle, Ar-Risala al-Qushayriya, starts with an elaboration of rational theology. When miracles were related to such authentic Sufis, they would dismiss them. It is related that Sahel ibn Abdullah al-Tustari was told of a man who, when he performs the ritual ablution, wudu', the water that trickled off his body turned into gold. Al-Tustari responded by saying, "These are toys given to children to play with." Bayazid al-Bistami, a great Sufi sage, was told of a man who apparently flew in the air and also walked on water. He responded by saying, "A housefly can fly, and some sea creatures walk across water." The reason for this attitude was that in Islam, a miracle could only be authentic in accordance with the claim, and the claim had to be made on rational terms. Miracles are generally understood as being a violation of the normal laws of physics and the material world, occurring by divine will at the hands of a genuine claimant. But how does one judge that the claimant is genuine in the first place? The only way of checking if the claimant is genuine is by checking if the message and the claim make rational sense. That is the role of rational theology. The theologians have given names for such occurrences at the hands of charlatans. By neglecting knowledge and rational theology, many people fall for erroneous concepts and consequently make wrong judgments, like believing that God is male, or that he can be contained in a particular direction, or bearing some resemblance to the creation, and various other fallacies that atheists make when debating the subject of God's divine existence. Many of the false notions that both theists and atheists have regarding God's divine attributes lead them to fall into the pitfalls of contradiction and subsequent skepticism. For such ailments, rational Kalām methodology is the cure. Kalām is a toolkit for fixing broken arguments and dismantling fallacious arguments, a simple testimony of faith without understanding or knowledge of what is being uttered, is condemnable as blind faith and a conformity, which will not guarantee salvation in the afterlife, especially if the person attesting that faith holds beliefs contradictory to Islam. 1.10. The Emergence of Dispute. The position of total literalism vis-à-vis the Qur'ān and the prophetic tradition, without recourse to legal theory and rational methodologies, started during the caliphate of Ali radiallahu anh. A group of young men declared Ali radiallahu anh and the rest of the Muslims as unbelievers, and left the congregation of Muslims. This group was foretold of by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who warned against young people in future generations who would read the Qur'an but not let it enter their hearts, even though they recited it melodiously, and that they would cite the narrations of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but due to a lack of intellect, they would take up arms and resort to violence. This group was known as the Khawarij, and it was the first divisive sect to appear in Islam. They would interpret many things literally, and citing sinful behavior would declare many Muslims unbelievers. Although in Islam, sin does not nullify faith but weakens it, the Khawarij would declare the sinner an unbeliever. The Sunni identification formed at that time, representing those who, in contradistinction to the Khawarij, ascribed to the traditional prophetic way. A renowned student of the Caliph Ali radiallahu anh was Hassan al-Basri. He had settled in the city of Basra in Iraq after the killing of the Caliph Uthman, who had been murdered by a schismatic group from Egypt, after which the Caliph Ali was selected as the leader of the faithful, Amir al-Mu'mineen, by the people. Hassan al-Basri taught in the Mosque of Basra where, during this period, many debates tackled the difficult theoretical questions. On one occasion, a man approached Hassan and asked for clarity on the position of a sinner. Was he a believer or an unbeliever? Before Hassan could respond, a student in the circle formulated an answer from his own mind and spoke out. Acknowledging that the Khawarij would typically declare a sinner an unbeliever, while the remaining Muslims tended to declare that he remained a believer despite sinning, the man who spoke up posited a third position which amounted to a rank between the two ranks of belief and unbelief, and he postulated that the sinner would end up in hell, but with a lesser punishment than the unbeliever. The name of this man was Wasil ibn Atta. He later left the circle of Hassan al-Basri and formed his own circle with its own unique views on various issues. Hassan al-Basri said regarding Wasil, "He has left us," which in Arabic is "i'tizal anna." Subsequently, the sect of Wasil, with its various offshoots, became known as the Mu'tazila. 1.11. The Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila are generally admired in Western discourse because of their giving the intellect superiority over divine revelation. When Greek books were translated into Arabic, initially by Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah, then later commissioned by Caliph Ma'mun, as well as many works translated by Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the Mu'tazila adopted Greek thought and took many of their theological positions from Greek philosophy. This initiated intellectual debate on issues never previously debated in centers of learning like Baghdad. Issues like the inherent eternal nature of the universe, the phenomenon of evil, whether the Creator was obliged to reward and punish or not, the resurrection of material bodies, the nature of life after death, whether particles are encompassed in the knowledge of God, or if the mind is able to determine good and evil, and similar types of questions. While the Abbasid caliphs remained Sunni, there was no real persecution of the freedom to debate such matters, and so the Mu'tazila debated with Sunni theologians in mosques throughout the caliphate. Not unique to the domains of theology, It was also occurring in other developing fields of literature, grammar, morphology, and Qur'ān recitation. Once the Mu'tazila were able to influence the caliphs, however, especially Ma'mun and Wathiq, they started persecuting anyone who disagreed with them on the nature of the Qur'an, whether it was God's speech, for example, and thus a divine attribute, or simply a creation of God. The Mu'tazila, and indeed Muslims in general, had encountered the Eastern Christian Church, and the point of dispute between them was over the divinity of Christ. To validate their view on this, the Christians made the argument that Christ was divine because he was an attribute of God, in the way that the Qur'an was an attribute of God according to Muslims, and like Christ came down to earth in the flesh. This was one of the many arguments forwarded by the Christians in places like Damascus and Alexandria. To avoid this ambiguousness, the Mu'tazila declared that God has no divine attributes, and whoever believed he had divine eternal attributes was a polytheist. In such a way, Sunni theologians were branded polytheists. This is where Kalām came to hand, and started becoming a tool for Sunni theologians who adhered to tradition, and at the same time promoting rational arguments to counter the Mu'tazila narrative. The Sunni rational theologians laid bare the inaccuracies of their opponents, whether Mu'tazila or Christians, by stating that the divine attribute of speech, Kalām, was an attribute found established with the essence of God, and not dwelling in creation as the Christians claimed. They established that the Qur'an was the speech of God, in the sense that it signifies the divine attributes, in the same way that the name of God, when written down, signifies the essence of God. That is to say, when a person writes down the name of God on paper, the ink is not divine, the paper is not divine, and the reciter of the name of God is not divine. Yet what is written and uttered signifies or infers the divine. Some Sunni traditionalists, most notably Ahmed ibn Hanbal, desisted from giving any elaborate explanation on these things, staying within the tradition. The accounts of scholars within the Sunni tradition who were subsequently persecuted severely are famous in the annals of history. Ahmed ibn Hanbal was prosecuted for his beliefs, and had numerous debates with the chief Mu'tazila of the time, Ahmed ibn Dawood and others. Once the caliphs returned to the Sunni positions on these philosophical and theological debates, the Mu'tazila sect nevertheless continued in the Muslim world, not silenced by persecution or the sword, but rather vanquished by Kalām, the rational use of the mind to uphold tradition. The Mu'tazila were dealt intellectual blows from the likes of Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and later Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi, whose story of the old woman was related earlier. Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari was a Mu'tazili disciple until he reached the age of 40. A student of the Mu'tazili philosopher Abu Ali al-Jubai, he too held the position that God must do for an individual what is beneficial for that individual, and that it was an obligation on God to do so. The traditional Sunni view, on the other hand, was that God was not obliged to do good or bad for the individual, and did whatever he willed. The Mu'tazila's view avoided difficult questions like why God created evil, or whether humans created their own actions, and thus to avoid getting stuck they would, unlike the Sunni, readily reformulate their creed. One day, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari asked his teacher, Abu Ali al-Jubai, "What do you say regarding 3 brothers, one of whom died obedient, another disobedient, and the third who died young?" Al-Jubai replied, "The first will be rewarded in paradise, the second will be punished in hell, and the third will not be punished." Al-Ash'ari further inquired, "What if the third, the one who died young, asked God why he made him die young, not keeping him alive so that he might have the chance to obey and thus enter paradise? How would God respond?" Al-Jubai replied, God would say that he knew the boy would grow up to disobey me and thereby enter hell, so I did what was better for him. This reply was based on the rule of the Muʿtazila, that God must do what is of benefit to the individual. In response to this, Al-Ash'ari said, "What if the second brother said, 'Why did you not make me die young, so as to have avoided disobeying you, and consequently going to hell?' How would God answer that?" This question so dumbfounded al-Juba'i that he remained silent, unable to respond. After returning home, Al-Ash'ari went into isolation, only to appear a few weeks later to renounce the Mu'tazila school and to adopt traditional Sunni beliefs. Al-Ash'ari went on to formulate the foundations of many later traditional responses to heresy and philosophical thinking, and this is the reason why the Sunni theologians are sometimes referred to as the Asha'ira. 1.12. The Modern Era. New atheism has not brought anything new to the discourse with the Kalām tradition. It has merely repackaged old arguments in new Western philosophical and scientific jargon, no different from those debated between the Mu'tazila and traditional Kalām theologians long ago. The Mu'tazila questioned the eternal universe then, as would an atheist today, citing Stephen Hawking's multiverse theory in his popularized attempts to remove God from the picture and to replace him with a theory that explains everything, a combination of quantum theory and relativity. A clear example of an antiquated argument is Antony Flou's God and Philosophy, where many of the objections he raises to the existence of God are based upon the same line of thinking as the Mu'tazila. These arguments had largely died in the Muslim world due to the intellectual counterattack of the Kalām tradition, but they still hold sway over some Western philosophers. Even during the British colonial period in Egypt, when some of the clerics of the Al-Azhar University were infected by Western thinking, after being exposed to old ideas in new language, an effective counteroffensive was led by the likes of Mustafa Sabri, who dealt a blow to new atheism and its offshoots. Scientism took off in this period, whereby people enamored by new technologies and inventions began to regard religion as the source of technological backwardness. There was a move to reduce all truths to the arena of science, labeling old Kalām arguments as outdated and tautological. This new epistemological approach was the harbinger of new atheism. Science is neutral. Its fruits are reaped by those who invest in it, irrelevant of religion, culture, race, or geographical location. Scientism, however, with all its scientific pretensions, has hijacked science, ignoring its uncharted territories. This is not a criticism of the scientific method, but since it requires time, the very mortality of succeeding generations of researchers can only but limit the progression made by each generation. The false promise of scientism, however, is for science to go beyond its scope of research and its limited contribution to human knowledge, and how much science has actually uncovered. Currently, for example, only 5 to 10% of all species on Earth have been classified and named. That science has more progress to make is patently obvious. The very nature of science is trial and error, falsifiability, and integrity. Humans can clearly know truths from other than science without contradicting science. How well Wittgenstein described the deception of modernism in that period, namely, the idea that laws of nature explain the world to us, when they merely describe structural realities. Such laws are descriptive and predictive, but are laws that create nothing. In some cases, these laws do not explain anything, thus incorrectly portraying that which indicates to nature as divine-like, since such laws are not creative or omniscient. Laws describe nature and as such do not create it, since they cannot exist prior to the very existence of the material they describe. So, what some atheist scientists do from the onset is to delineate the questions science is permitted to ask, and to eliminate God from the picture because while science looks at the how and why to a degree, it does not question the purpose of something. Even human consciousness, that which is within us, has not been reduced to a scientific law. This is no faulting of science, but an observation that the deifying of science and the scientific method is inherently flawed. Even if the modern debate between Islam and atheism were not revolving around the domain of science, and the assertion of Islam's scientific backwardness, see Chapter 5, there is one domain which is dreaded by the Anglo-European, or any bigoted detractor of Islam with their brand of atheism, and that is the Sharia, the law of Islam, and the governance of Islam. Those who find the Sharia disagreeable will assemble their arguments to renounce belief in God and Islam, largely through their disagreement with Islamic law. This singular issue has politicized the debate between Islam and atheism. Therefore, the debate today with atheism is entangled with political issues, ranging from domestic abuse in Saudi Arabia and its unique interpretation of Sharia law, to suicide bombers in already destabilized countries. These arguments can range from the non sequitur to the totally irrelevant. When, recently, a Saudi woman fled the domestic abuse of her family after taking asylum in Canada, the headline reads, "Saudi teen granted asylum in Canada makes the most of her new life, eating bacon for breakfast and grabbing a Starbucks coffee with her legs exposed." The above headline highlights the xenophobic rhetoric being fueled by major news corporations to evoke emotive responses from both sides. As well as that, such headlines instill fear in the mind of the reader, illustrating an alien community or cult which seeks to remove their freedoms. Similar accounts of propaganda were seen in Nazi Germany, when Jewish communities were maligned and marginalized from the population to be seen as the common enemy. This recalls another incident where a woman leaves Islam for cultural reasons. Obviously, random cultures like the old Saudi law banning women from driving are to be found mixed in with Islam. Trying to convince her sister to leave Islam, the best proof that she could furnish was, "Then you can eat whatever you want," in reference to the dietary restrictions of Islamic law. That those dietary laws may be there for our own well-being can hardly impinge on such a proof. This ongoing war of words, alongside the wars on terrorism and counterterrorism, are to be found not only in New Atheism, but have roots in the religious fanaticism of Charles Martel, the Crusades, and later the imperial powers that developed from the wealth of Muslim Mughal India and Black Africa. The philosophies that are found with this undercurrent may shift, but the same attitude remains. From exporting Christianity to Muslims, blacks, and natives of new lands, to the deliberate spread of neoliberal and humanist ideas to the Muslim world, all the while disparaging their entire tradition as inferior, backward, and unfit for the modern world, it is inevitable that what is modern and what is barbaric is determined by the Anglo-European power structure. The attitudes are the same today as they were when Prime Minister Gladstone of Britain is reported to have said in Parliament, holding up a copy of the Qur'ān in his hand, "So long as the Egyptians have got this book with them, we will never be able to enjoy quiet or peace in that land." In his memoirs, Salahuddin as-Sabagh devoted a number of chapters to the principles in which he believed. He wrote, "I do not believe in the democracy of the English, the Nazism of the Germans, or the Bolshevism of the Russians. I am a Muslim Arab, and for me there is no substitute for this among all the views and philosophies. I want no comparison or preference among them, as this is sterile and meaningless, for wherever I turn, I see the foreign wolf preying upon and torturing my nation. In the Mediterranean, Oman, the Persian Gulf, in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, and near the tomb of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There is no more murderous wolf for the Arabs, and no deadlier foe of Islam than Britain. As for the Arabs, they have been torn apart into small countries, communities, and tribes that fight each other. If Arabs seeking freedom rise up in Palestine, Egypt, Aden, the 7 Sheikdoms, and Iraq, the guillotine is sharpened for them, and bombers are loaded with fire. 350 million Muslims are still groaning under the yoke of British imperialism. The bloody Lionheart of the Crusaders' wars was an Englishman, and so was Allenby, who conquered Jerusalem and said, "Now the Crusades are over." As was Gladstone, who threw the Qur'ān into a closet and said, "There will be no quiet in the world as long as this remains." As indeed was Cromer, who said, "Only this Quran impedes civilization." Even Antony Flew, after having renounced atheism, when questioned on the nature of God as he saw it, said, "I am thinking of a God very different from the God of the Christians, and far and away from the God of Islam, because both are depicted as omnipotent Oriental despots, cosmic Saddam Husseins." Flew's perspective, it would seem, was born because of the Anglo-European attitude toward divinely revealed law, and the nightmare of what Europe experienced under the Roman Catholic Church, its interpretation of the Christian faith, and its various persecutions and inquisitions, even on those who believed in Jesus Christ. But the view regarding Islam is deep-rooted in old Anglo-European derision and phobia of Islam, the Moor, the Saracen, the Turk, and other nightmares of the past. Flew said in regard to Islam that it is best described in a Marxian way, as the uniting and justifying ideology of Arab imperialism. 1.13. 15 Atheistic Fallacies. When discussing Islam in general, or the Sharia specifically, one often encounters some common fallacies presented by atheists, former Muslims, or any detractors of Islam. Herewith are presented 15 of those fallacies. The reader can take note of these and consider those making them. 1. Generalizing something which is specific. If a person cites a verse of the Qur'an that has specific application to an event, or a ruling given in a specific situation, but then generalizes the application, then he has fallen into this fallacy. This can happen with a prophetic report, hadith, as well. Commonly, this occurs with regard to verses on the military code of warfare as related in chapters 8 and 9 of the Qur'an, that relate to certain historical settings, yet always cited by detractors of Islam and literalists, who invoke some tendency of Muslims to resort to violence. 2. Specifying something which is general. There may be something general, a rule which is general, and the atheist may commit the fallacy of ascribing specificity to it. For instance, a general prophetic injunction states, "Do not kill women and children, non-combatants, in war." Witnessing the actions of present-day terrorist organizations, an atheist might be tempted to believe that this prohibition was specific and not general, thus assuming that the legal floodgates were left open for such organizations to exploit. 3. Additions which are not in the original. This is where general statements in the Qur'an and prophetic statements are added to, creating a fallacy not found in the original statement. 4. Hiding conditions and limits which change the context. This can happen when quoting a legal ruling verse of the Qur'an, like those regarding the amputation of the hand of a thief, for example. 5. Using quotes without the previous or following text. This happens often with the verses of jihad. Once a Christian came to a local mosque to debate with me. The debate lasted a few weeks, and the first topic was jihad and violence in the Qur'an. Together, we placed the entire verses of the Qur'an relating to jihad together, and on seeing the true context, he dropped his entire argument relating to jihad. Then the verses of the Bible were scrutinized with regard to violence, and he was challenged to place those verses in their proper context, which he was unable to do so, rather saying that those verses were from the Old Testament, while the verses of mercy were from the New Testament. This is despite the fact that there are verses of violence in the New Testament that many Christians remain ignorant of, as in Luke 19:27, and the point was lost on him. Instead, the point was made that the God of the Old and New Testaments is the same God, and therefore the same one commanding the killings of innocent women, children, and even animals, Isaiah 13:9-16, or Judges 18:1-28, or 1 Samuel 15:3, and numerous other passages. On the other hand, with the Qur'ān, he could not validate his claims when the verses relating to jihad were placed in context. 6. Playing with the meaning of the text to establish a point. The meaning may be clear, but sometimes a person may attempt to change the meaning in order to make a point, another kind of fallacy. In one debate, a woman tried asserting that the Qur'an legislated child marriage, and in so doing quoted a particular verse. When the verse was recited, it was clear that it had no such meaning. The verse reads, "And those who no longer expect menstruation among your women, if you doubt, then their period is 3 months, and also for those who have not menstruated. And for those who are pregnant, their term is until they give birth. And whoever fears Allah, He will make for him of his matter ease." Qur'ān 65:4. The part regarding those who have not menstruated was being coerced to mean something other than in the text. 7. The straw man fallacy. A well-known fallacy where a presumption is made, and then attacked according to the disputant's own devices. 8. Using an isolated aberrant opinion or an anomalous juristic opinion, ijtihad, and applying that to Islam as a whole. Ijtihad signifies a difference of opinion amongst scholars on a given point, and each scholar will exert his efforts to infer the correct judgment. In some cases, a person totally unqualified in clerical scholastic training will be put forward as a scholar of Islam, a favorite ploy of many detractors of Islam, especially when such a person may hold violent or extremist viewpoints. 9. Using the position of a sect within Islam as the given position of Islam. The given position of Islam would be an unequivocal verse from the Qur'an, in the due terms of what it alludes to, a prophetic narration that is mass transmitted and has never been rejected by Muslims as a whole, along with the consensus-based positions of all Muslims. The given position of one sect cannot be presented as the position of Islam, because Islam was, and is, a free religion. The greatest evidence of this freedom was during the first 200 years of Islam, when the number of sects exceeded the number of sects there are today. The mosques of Kufa and Basra were filled with various groups debating different theological points. There were thus a variety of views on issues, none of which could be cited as the default position of Islam. 10. Texts attributed without verification. For the present purpose, a single example is cited and is then appropriately critiqued. In 640 CE, the Muslims took the city of Alexandria. Upon learning of a great library containing all the knowledge of the world, the conquering general supposedly asked Caliph Umar for instructions. The Caliph has been quoted as saying of the library's holdings, "They will either contradict the Qur'an, in which case they are heresy, or they will agree with it, so they are superfluous." So, allegedly, all the texts were destroyed and used as fuel for the bathhouses of the city. Even then, it was said to have taken 6 months to burn all the documents. These details, from the Caliph's instruction to the unconvincing 6 months it supposedly took to burn all the books, were not written down until 300 years after the event. These facts condemning Caliph Umar radiallahu anh, were written by Bishop Gregory Bar Hebraeus, a Christian who had spent a great deal of time writing about Muslim atrocities without much historical documentation. Verification for Muslim scholarship would require looking at the transmitters of any report and their biographies, and verifying whether the chain of narration was unbroken. Citations in historical books is not sufficient evidence to establish historical fact, with mass transmission of an occurrence being needed, or a clear chain of transmission that can be scrutinized. Unlike modern archaeology, where remnants of historical artifacts will be found, and deductions or inductions will be made from those, the Muslim hadith methodology of narrators, biographies, the checking of synchronic layers of narrators and narrator reliability, along with accreditation and discreditation, amounts to a much more accurate method of imparting certainty. 11. Hiding or sheer ignorance of valid texts. In an attempt to make the claim that Islam permits violence, or curtails the rights of other groups, certain citations may be made from the Qur'ān or prophetic traditions, while at the same time the verses or traditions that contradict that claim may be hidden on purpose or through pure ignorance. 12. Science is based upon atheism. This fallacy attempts to make an intrinsic link with atheism and science, when in reality the vast majority of scientists in the past have been theists, whether Muslim or non-Muslim. Science is neutral. 13. The red herring or the side trimming. This is when one thing is being discussed, and the interlocutor brings up something else which is totally irrelevant to the issue at hand. 14. Appeal to popularity or authority. If something is popular, it does not make it factual. Likewise, in Islam, there is no pope-like authority, and the authority of a caliph or a mufti is limited in scope, as they do not make the law or creed. Islam has already been expounded in the Qur'an and the prophetic tradition, while the roles of later authority figures are limited to a few things. The Mufti of Saudi Arabia or the Ayatollah of Iran cannot be cited as authorities. 15. Misusing words. A word can be totally taken out of its true import, either out of ignorance or just to win an argument. This happened once in a debate when a Christian woman said, "Allah worships the Prophet because the Qur'an says so." She quoted the following verse, "Indeed, Allah confers blessings upon the Prophet, and his angels ask him to do so. O you who have believed, ask Allah to confer blessing upon him, and ask Allah to grant him peace." Qur'an 33:56. She contested that the Arabic word yusalluna could only mean prayer, not carrying any other meaning. Of course, this was sheer ignorance of Arabic, and when that was pointed out, she conceded that Arab Christians all held a similar view. They were falling into this fallacy because earlier in the same chapter the verse reads, "It is he who confers blessing upon you, and his angels ask him to do so, that he may bring you out from darknesses into the light. And ever is he, to the believers, merciful." Qur'an 33:43. In this verse, the same verb is used, and is meant to confer blessings, and not the act of worship. Despite evidence produced from lexicons and dictionaries, the point was not accepted, and the contradictory position was maintained.